Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, here to lead you through tonight's chilling journey. If you find these stories help you unwind or gently guide you to sleep, consider supporting the channel by liking this video and subscribing if you haven't already. It truly helps bring more of these stories to you. Also, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and the time where you are. It's always fascinating to connect with listeners around the world. So, take a deep breath, settle in, and prepare yourself for a night of mystery and suspense. Ryan Carter had always been different. While other kids were outside playing sports or hanging out at the mall, he was buried in his collection of horror movies. His obsession with the genre started young, watching old slasher films with his older brother Tom, who had an affinity for all things dark and twisted. Together they'd spend hours watching films about haunted houses, cursed objects, and unspeakable creatures. But what had begun as innocent fun soon spiraled into something far darker, something Ryan couldn't escape from. As Ryan grew older, his love for horror only deepened. He wasn't just a fan anymore. He was obsessed. His room was lined with shelves full of VHS tapes and DVDs, movies that most people wouldn't dare to watch alone at night. It wasn't just about the scares anymore. It was about understanding the mechanics of fear. Ryan wanted to know what made people terrified, how a film could crawl under your skin and make you question everything. It wasn't enough to watch the films. He studied them. He analyzed every shot, every sound, and every plot twist. By the time Ryan was in college, his obsession had taken over his life. He no longer had time for friends or normal social activities. Instead, he spent his days in the library, researching horror film theory, and his nights watching obscure, forgotten films that most people hadn't even heard of. His friends had long since stopped inviting him to hang out, and Tom had distanced himself, sensing that something about Ryan was changing. It was during his sophomore year that things started to get strange. Ryan found a peculiar movie at a local thrift store, a film that was so old it looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. The cover was worn and faded, with an image of an eerie mansion under a blood-red sky. The title was barely legible, but something about it intrigued him. He couldn't explain why, but he felt an immediate connection to it. It was like it was calling out to him, beckoning him to watch it. He bought the film, eager to add it to his collection. The moment he inserted it into the player and pressed play, the room seemed to grow colder. The movie was unlike anything Ryan had ever seen. The plot was minimal, the acting stiff, and the special effects non-existent. But there was something deeply unsettling about it. As the film progressed, Ryan felt an odd, creeping sensation at the back of his mind, as if the very air around him was thickening, becoming heavier. The movie told the story of a group of friends who visited an abandoned mansion, only to find themselves trapped by a malevolent force. As they explored the house, they uncovered disturbing secrets, and one by one, they were picked off in gruesome, unexplained ways. The tension was suffocating, and despite the low budget and amateurish acting, Ryan couldn't tear his eyes away. It wasn't the violence or the jump scares that unsettled him. It was the feeling that the house in the movie was real, that it existed somewhere, and that it was calling to him. After the movie ended, Ryan felt strangely empty. The kind of emptiness that came from experiencing something that left a mark on you, something that lingered long after the credits rolled. He tried to shake the feeling off, but it clung to him, following him throughout the day. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard a noise, a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. At first, he thought it was just the house settling, but then the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was as though something, or someone, was trying to get in. Ryan tried to ignore it, chalking it up to his overactive imagination, but the sound persisted, keeping him awake through the night. By morning, he was exhausted and on edge. He looked around his room, half expecting to see something lurking in the corners, but nothing was there. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that it was just a side effect of watching too many horror movies. However, the events didn't stop there. Over the next few days, Ryan began to notice more strange occurrences. Books from his shelves would be out of place, scattered across the floor in a chaotic mess. His lights flickered even when the power was steady. But the most unsettling thing was the shadow. He would catch glimpses of it from the corner of his eye, a dark figure standing in the hallway, or at the edge of his bed, just out of sight. Whenever he turned to look directly at it, it was gone, leaving him wondering if he was simply imagining things. As time passed, these incidents grew more frequent. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, but he couldn't figure out what it was or where it was coming from. It wasn't until one night, when he decided to watch the movie again, that the truth began to reveal itself. This time, as the movie played, Ryan began to notice something strange. The images on the screen seemed to blur, the colors warping into shapes that didn't belong. Faces appeared in the background of the frames, faces that weren't there before, faces that looked oddly familiar. As the characters in the movie explored the mansion, they stumbled upon a dusty old mirror, and in that reflection, Ryan saw something that made his blood run cold. His own face, staring back at him from within the film. He gasped and jumped back from the screen, his heart racing. The movie had been nothing more than a low-budget horror film. How could this be possible? His reflection wasn't part of the original footage. It couldn't have been. But as he watched in horror, the reflection in the film began to move, as if it were a real person. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. His reflection in the film mouthed a single word: help. Before he could react, the screen flickered violently, and the image was replaced by static. Ryan grabbed the remote and tried to turn the TV off, but it wouldn't respond. The static grew louder, more chaotic, until it drowned out everything else. Then the room went completely dark. Ryan fumbled to find the light switch, his heart pounding in his chest. When the lights came back on, he was stunned by what he saw. The walls of his room were no longer the same. They were covered in strange symbols, the kind of symbols he had only seen in old occult texts. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and in the corner of the room, an old cracked mirror stood where none had been before. As he approached the mirror, he saw the reflection of his own face once again. But this time, the reflection smiled, a cold, malicious grin that was not his own. Ryan stumbled back, horrified, and the reflection in the mirror slowly raised its hand, pointing directly at him. "You shouldn't have watched it," it whispered in a voice that was unmistakably his, but twisted, as though it were coming from somewhere deep inside him. Suddenly, the air around Ryan felt suffocating. He gasped for breath as the shadows in the room began to shift, forming into shapes that resembled the twisted figures from the film he had watched. They reached toward him, their hands outstretched, pulling him into the mirror. Ryan screamed, but no sound came out. The last thing he saw before he was consumed by the darkness was the reflection in the mirror, smiling wider than ever. Days passed before anyone noticed Ryan was missing. His friends and family searched the apartment, but there was no sign of him. The only thing that remained was the old horror movie he had found in the thrift store, lying on the floor of his room. The cover was still worn, and the title was barely legible, but the one thing that had changed was the reflection on the cover. It was Ryan's face, staring back at them from the other side of the glass. It was just after sunset when Chris moved into the new house. He had been looking for a fresh start for months, and the small cottage on the outskirts of town seemed like the perfect escape. Away from the noise of the city, nestled between the woods and an old cemetery, it offered a peaceful retreat. The price was right, the house charming in its rustic simplicity. The only drawback was the neighbor. Mrs. Harris, the elderly woman who lived next door, was known around town as a bit of a recluse. People didn't know much about her, other than the fact that she had lived in that house for decades. Most people said she was harmless, just a little eccentric. Some even claimed she had a strange, unsettling presence. But Chris wasn't one to indulge in small-town gossip. He was here for peace and quiet, not to make friends. On his first night, as Chris was unpacking his boxes, he noticed Mrs. Harris watching him from her window. The curtains fluttered slightly, and her eyes locked with his for a brief moment. It was a strange feeling, almost as if she were sizing him up. But Chris brushed it off. It was probably just curiosity. Everyone was always interested when new people moved in. The next day, he took a walk around the property to explore. The house was surrounded by a thick hedge of overgrown shrubs, and beyond that, the dense woods stretched endlessly. There was an old stone path that led to a back gate, which Chris thought would be a perfect shortcut to town. As he walked along the path, he couldn't help but notice the strange, almost oppressive silence that seemed to cling to the area. The trees swayed gently in the wind, but there was no bird song, no rustling of small animals. It was as though the whole forest was holding its breath. When Chris returned to his house, he saw Mrs. Harris again, standing by the fence that separated their properties. She didn't speak, just stared at him with her pale, unblinking eyes. Her skin was thin, almost translucent, and her hair, long and silver, hung down in wild tangles. Her clothes were old-fashioned and her movements were slow and deliberate. Chris waved politely, but she didn't acknowledge him. Instead, she turned and walked back into her house without a word. Over the next few weeks, Chris tried to keep to himself. He settled into his routine, waking up early, working from home, and taking long walks through the woods when he needed a break. But no matter where he went, it seemed like Mrs. Harris was always there, lurking at the edge of his vision. Sometimes he would catch a glimpse of her standing by the window, staring out at him. Other times, he would see her walking slowly around her yard, as if waiting for something. One evening, as he was sitting in his living room, Chris heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find Mrs. Harris standing on the porch, her hands clasped in front of her. She smiled, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good evening, Chris," she said in a voice that was soft, almost too soft. "I just wanted to welcome you properly. I'm so glad you've settled in." Chris nodded awkwardly. "Thank you, Mrs. Harris. It's been a quiet few weeks." She studied him for a long moment, her pale eyes narrowing slightly. "It's always quiet here," she murmured. "But quiet can be dangerous. You should be careful, you know. Not everyone who lives in this town is as friendly as they seem." Chris felt a chill run down his spine, but he tried to laugh it off. "I'll be fine. I'm just here to enjoy the peace." Mrs. Harris didn't respond. Instead, she gave him a strange, lingering look before turning and walking away, her steps slow and deliberate, almost as if she were floating just above the ground. Chris watched her retreating figure, feeling uneasy but unsure of why. The next day, things began to feel different. Chris noticed the strange quietness around his home once more, but this time it was different. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating. As he went about his day, he began hearing faint sounds, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, like soft, unintelligible voices. He thought it was just his imagination, but the whispers grew louder with each passing day. At night, the sounds became even more pronounced. He would hear footsteps in the hall, the creaking of the floorboards, and the sound of something, or someone, scratching at the door. He would rush to check, but no one was ever there. Each time he opened the door, the air outside was thick with darkness, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. One evening, after a particularly unsettling night, Chris decided to confront Mrs. Harris. He walked over to her house, his mind racing with questions. When he knocked on the door, she answered almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for him. "Chris, my dear, what brings you by?" Her voice was syrupy sweet, but there was an edge to it that made Chris's skin crawl. "I need to talk to you," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's something wrong here. I keep hearing things. Voices, footsteps, like someone's in my house." Mrs. Harris's smile faltered for just a moment, and her eyes seemed to glint with something dark, something ancient. "Oh, I'm sure it's just the house settling, dear. Old houses have a way of making strange sounds. But—" She paused, her lips curling into a thin, tight smile. "There are things in this town that are better left unknown. You should be careful who you trust." Chris didn't know how to respond. The woman's cryptic words unsettled him, but he didn't press further. Instead, he turned and left, feeling as though the air itself had thickened with an unseen weight. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences around Chris's home escalated. He began seeing figures in the corners of his vision, shadows that moved just beyond the reach of his gaze. He'd hear someone whispering his name, and when he turned around, no one would be there. But one night, as he sat in his living room, he saw something he couldn't explain. In the reflection of his window, he saw Mrs. Harris standing outside, staring at him. But she wasn't standing still. She was moving, inching closer to his door, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed on him with a predatory focus. As he watched, she reached out, her thin fingers pressing against the glass. Suddenly the whispers began again, louder now, more insistent. It was as though the walls themselves were alive with sound, pressing in on him from all sides. He jumped up, heart pounding, and rushed to the door, flinging it open. But there was nothing there, only the quiet, empty yard, and the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. That night, Chris couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every creak, every groan of the house made him jump. He finally decided to leave. He grabbed his things and walked outside, intending to head to the town for some answers. But as he stepped out into the yard, he froze. Standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the trees, was Mrs. Harris. She was watching him from the darkness, her eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, as though waiting for him to make the next move. With a sinking feeling in his stomach, Chris realized that the house, the town, was not what it seemed. Mrs. Harris wasn't just a strange neighbor. She was part of something far older, something that had been waiting for him to come. The whispers, the shadows, the feeling of being hunted, they had all been warning signs. But it was too late now. As he took a step toward her, the ground beneath him seemed to shift, and the whispers grew louder, filling his ears with words he couldn't understand. His heart raced, and for the first time, he realized that there was no escape. Mrs. Harris had been watching him all along, and now he was part of her world, a world where the dark things in the shadows came to life. The last thing Chris heard, before the darkness swallowed him whole, was her voice, soft but unmistakable. "Welcome home." It was a moonless night when Will Harper first heard the legend of the Crossroads Oath. He was sitting at a bonfire with a group of friends, their laughter and chatter echoing into the quiet night. The Crossroads, as they called it, was an unmarked intersection just outside of town, hidden deep in the woods where no one ventured after dark. People say if you go there at midnight, Jake, the self-proclaimed storyteller of the group, said in a hushed tone, and bring an offering, you can summon something. Something that'll grant your deepest wish. Sounds like a load of bull, Will replied, tossing a stick into the fire. Jake smirked. You think so? They say it's real. My uncle swears a guy he knew went there years ago, desperate to save his farm. The next week he struck oil. But... Jake's voice trailed off dramatically. But what? Jake leaned closer, his face lit by the flickering flames. But he disappeared a year later. They found his truck at the crossroads, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of him. The group laughed nervously, brushing off the story as nothing more than small-town folklore. But Will couldn't shake the feeling that Jake wasn't entirely joking. That night, as Will lay in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, the words echoed in his mind. Grant your deepest wish. Will's life hadn't exactly been going according to plan. He was stuck in a dead-end job, his dreams of being a musician fading with every passing year. His band had fallen apart months ago, and he barely had enough money to keep his beat-up car running. The idea of a quick fix, no matter how ridiculous, was tempting. By midnight the following night, Will found himself driving down the narrow dirt road leading to the crossroads. His headlights cut through the dense fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. The trees loomed on either side of the road, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. When he reached the intersection, he parked his car and stepped out, clutching an old guitar, his offering. The legend had been vague about what to bring, but Jake had mentioned that the item had to mean something to you. This guitar had been his first, the one his dad had given him when he was just a kid. It hurt to part with it, but if the legend was true, it would be worth it. He placed the guitar in the center of the crossroads and stepped back, his breath fogging in the cold night air. For a moment, nothing happened, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Then, he felt it. The air grew heavier, charged with an unnatural stillness. The wind stopped and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The shadows around the intersection deepened, pooling together like liquid darkness. "You've come to bargain." The voice was smooth, almost melodic, and it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Will turned, and there, standing just beyond the edge of his car's headlights, was a figure. The man, or at least it appeared to be a man, was dressed in a sharp black suit that seemed to absorb the light. His eyes glinted like polished obsidian, and his smile was too wide, too sharp. Will swallowed hard. "Yeah, I heard you can grant wishes." The man stepped closer, his movements unnaturally fluid. "Wishes? No, my boy. I grant potential, but it comes at a cost." Will hesitated. What kind of cost? The man's smile widened. "Everything worth having requires a sacrifice. You want fame, fortune, a second chance at your dreams. I can give you that, but one day I'll come to collect." Will's heart pounded. He'd heard enough stories to know that deals like this were never simple, but he was desperate. He was tired of being invisible, of feeling like he'd missed his shot. "What happens when you come to collect?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man tilted his head, as if amused by the question. "Does it matter? You'll have everything you've ever wanted until that day comes." Will looked down at the guitar lying in the dirt. This was crazy, insane, but what did he have to lose? "I'll do it," he said, his voice trembling. The man's grin turned predatory. "Good." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of parchment. Words began to appear on it, written in a language Will didn't recognize. The man handed him a pen. "Sign, and it's done." Will hesitated for only a moment before scrawling his name across the bottom. As soon as the ink dried, the man snapped his fingers, and the parchment burst into flames, disappearing in an instant. "Your wish is granted," the man said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Enjoy it while it lasts." Before Will could respond, the man stepped back into the shadows and vanished, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind picking up once more. At first, it seemed like a dream. Within weeks, Will's music career skyrocketed. He found himself playing sold-out shows, his songs climbing the charts. Money, fame, adoration, everything he'd ever wanted was his. But as the months went by, strange things began to happen. It started small, shadows in the corner of his eye, whispers in the dark. Then, one night, as he stood backstage before a performance, he saw the man in the black suit, watching him from the crowd. No one else seemed to notice. The sightings became more frequent. The man would appear in mirrors in the background of photographs, always watching, always smiling. Will tried to ignore it, but the fear began to eat away at him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think. The success that had once brought him joy now felt like a prison. And then, 1 year to the day after he'd made the deal, Will woke up to find himself back at the crossroads. His guitar lay at his feet, untouched by time. The man in the black suit stood before him, his smile as sharp as ever. "It's time," he said simply. Will wanted to run, to scream, but his body wouldn't move. The shadows around him closed in, and as they consumed him, the last thing he heard was the man's voice, soft and mocking. "Be careful what you wish for." When the sun rose the next morning, the crossroads was empty. There was no sign of Will, only the faint sound of a guitar string humming softly in the wind. Every town has its urban legends, whispered among locals and passed down through generations. In the small, sleepy town of Coldwater, the tale that kept people indoors one specific night each year was that of the suited ghost. The legend went like this. Every year, on the last night of October, a man dressed in a flawless black suit would appear on the outskirts of town. He wasn't like the other legends of ghouls or monsters that stalked the dark. No, This figure would simply sit on a worn wooden bench near an abandoned train station, playing a haunting melody on a violin. The melody was said to be so beautiful, so soul-stirring, that anyone who heard it couldn't help but follow it. Those who did never returned. Nathan had heard the story 100 times growing up. His grandmother had been the most adamant about it, warning him to always lock his doors and windows on Halloween night and to never, under any circumstances, venture toward the station. "It's just a story, Nana," Nathan would laugh, rolling his eyes, but her weathered face would turn serious. "It's not a story, boy. I saw him once when I was your age. My best friend Lila followed the music, and she never came back." He'd heard this story so many times, he could recite it word for word. Yet as Nathan grew older, he dismissed it as nothing more than a cautionary tale to keep kids from wandering too far at night. Now 27 and back in Coldwater after years of living in the city, Nathan found himself thinking about the legend as Halloween approached. The town hadn't changed much. Same quiet streets, same familiar faces, but the train station was even more derelict than he remembered. Curiosity gnawed at him. What harm would it do to see for himself? Halloween night was cold, with a sharp wind that carried the scent of fallen leaves. Nathan wrapped his jacket tighter around himself as he walked toward the edge of town. The streets were eerily quiet. Even the usual Halloween decorations felt subdued, as if the townsfolk were honoring some unspoken rule to stay indoors. The old train station came into view, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. The platform was rotted, and the bench sat beneath a broken street lamp, its glow flickering weakly. Nathan waited, feeling equal parts foolish and intrigued. Midnight came and went, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Just as he was about to give up, he heard it. The first note was soft, like the whisper of a breeze. Then another and another, until a melody filled the air, weaving itself into the stillness of the night. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. The sound was unlike anything he'd ever heard, achingly beautiful, yet so full of sorrow it made his chest tighten. He couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it felt as though the music was calling to him, beckoning him closer. And then he saw him. Sitting on the old bench was a man, his posture straight and elegant. He was dressed in a pristine black suit, the fabric catching the faint light as he moved his bow across the strings of a polished violin. Nathan's feet moved before his brain could stop them. He approached slowly, the music pulling him in like a magnet. The man didn't look up, his focus entirely on the violin. When Nathan was just a few feet away, the man finally spoke, his voice soft and melodic, matching the tone of his music. "You shouldn't be here," he said without turning. Nathan froze. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but curiosity won out. Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The man stopped playing and looked up, his face partially obscured by the shadows. His eyes, however, were unmistakable, dark and piercing, as though they could see straight into Nathan's soul. "I am no one," the man replied, "just a player of songs long forgotten." Nathan swallowed hard. "Why do you do this? Why come here every year?" The man's lips curled into a sad smile. "A promise, one made long ago and one I cannot break." Nathan felt a chill run down his spine. "A promise to who?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he lifted the violin again and began to play. The melody was different this time, darker, heavier, and laced with an unrelenting sorrow. Nathan felt the air grow colder, the world around him fading as the music consumed him. "You should leave," the man said between notes, "before it's too late." But Nathan couldn't move. The music wrapped around him, pulling him deeper into its spell. His vision blurred, and the edges of the world seemed to dissolve into shadows. The last thing he saw was the man's face, pale, haunting, and etched with an eternity of grief. When Nathan woke, he was lying in the middle of the road, the sun rising over the horizon. His head throbbed, and his body ached as if he'd been hit by a truck. He stumbled back into town, confused and disoriented. People stared as he passed. their expressions a mix of shock and pity. "Nathan," his grandmother whispered when he stumbled through her door, her face pale as she clutched her rosary. "What did you do?" I saw him," Nathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes widened with fear. "Did he speak to you? Did you follow the music?" Nathan nodded slowly. I didn't mean to." Her face crumpled. "You've marked yourself, boy. He'll come for you now. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day you'll hear that melody again. And when you do, there'll be no coming back." Nathan wanted to argue, to say it wasn't real, but deep down, he knew she was right. For weeks, he tried to convince himself it had all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much imagination. But every so often, late at night, he swore he could hear it, the faint strains of a violin drifting on the wind. And he knew, without a doubt, that one day the man in the black suit would return. Kevin was a popular YouTuber running the channel Midnight Mysteries. Specializing in urban legends and haunted places, his eerie videos had once captivated millions. But lately, his channel was losing momentum. He needed a story so compelling that it would bring his audience back in droves. One evening, while scrolling through his inbox, Kevin found a strange email titled, "A Real Mystery for Midnight Mysteries." The message was brief. "There's a ghost town outside the city. It's not on any map, but I can give you the coordinates. The legend goes, anyone who documents the place disappears. But if you make it out, you'll have the story of a lifetime." Below the text were a set of GPS coordinates. Kevin's first instinct was to dismiss it as a prank. But curiosity and desperation got the better of him. The idea of being the first to expose a truly hidden location was too tempting. If it was real, it could be the viral hit he needed. The drive took hours, taking him deeper into desolate countryside where cell service was non-existent. As night fell, Kevin arrived at the coordinates. His headlights illuminated a dirt road lined with skeletal trees, leading into a cluster of dilapidated buildings barely visible in the moonlight. He grabbed his camera and tripod, double-checking his equipment before stepping out of the car. The air was unnervingly still, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the gravel. The ghost town was exactly as described: old, abandoned, and unsettlingly quiet. A row of wooden storefronts sagged with age, their windows shattered, and a church steeple loomed in the distance. Kevin set up his camera, speaking into the lens with his trademark dramatic tone. "This is it, folks, a forgotten town, shrouded in mystery. Let's see if we can uncover its secrets." As he walked through the town, recording every creak and shadow, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He chalked it up to nerves and focused on capturing footage. An hour into filming, Kevin noticed something odd. He'd been walking in a straight line, but somehow he kept ending up in the same spot, a rusted lamppost near the center of town. "Okay," he muttered to himself, "just losing my sense of direction." But the more he tried to leave, the more the town seemed to shift around him. Streets twisted, buildings rearranged, and landmarks disappeared. Panic crept in as he realized he was trapped. He turned off the camera and decided to retrace his steps back to the car. That's when he saw it, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. "Hello!" he called out, his voice echoing unnaturally. There was no response, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Shadows began to move where there shouldn't have been any, creeping along the edges of his vision. Kevin started to run. When he reached the car, it was no longer there. The dirt road was gone, too, replaced by endless rows of decaying buildings stretching into the darkness. Frantic, Kevin pulled out his camera and began recording again, hoping to capture proof of what was happening. "If anyone finds this," he said, his voice shaking, "this isn't a prank. The town, it's alive. It won't let me leave." As he spoke, the shadows coalesced into a humanoid shape. It stood several feet away, its form indistinct but undeniably menacing. Kevin backed away, keeping the camera trained on the figure. "What do you want?" he shouted. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it raised an arm, pointing toward the center of town. Against his better judgment, Kevin felt compelled to follow. The shadow led him to a building he hadn't noticed before, a small theater with a cracked marquee that read, "The Final Show." Inside, rows of dusty seats faced a stage shrouded in darkness. The shadow gestured for him to step onto the stage. Kevin hesitated but found himself moving forward, as though his body was no longer under his control. As he stood in the spotlight, the seats began to fill. One by one, shadowy figures appeared, their faceless forms staring up at him in silence. Kevin's camera, still in his hand, began recording on its own. The red light blinked steadily, and a voice, not his own, whispered from the speakers above, "Tell your story." Heart-pounding, Kevin recounted everything he'd seen. The words poured out of him, raw and unfiltered. The figures listened intently, their heads tilting in unison. When he finished, the theater erupted into deafening applause. The sound was otherworldly, echoing in ways that made Kevin's skin crawl. Then the lights went out. Kevin woke up in his apartment the next morning, the events of the night feeling like a fever dream. But when he checked his camera, the footage was there, every chilling moment. He uploaded the video to his channel with the title, "The Town That Traps You Forever." It went viral almost immediately, garnering millions of views and thrusting Kevin back into the spotlight. Fans and skeptics alike dissected the footage, debating its authenticity. But Kevin wasn't celebrating. Every night since uploading the video, he heard the applause. Soft at first, then louder, echoing through his apartment. He stopped sleeping, the sound driving him to the edge of madness. And then, one evening, he noticed something on his channel. A new video had appeared, one he hadn't uploaded. It was titled, "The Final Upload." When he clicked on it, his blood ran cold. The video showed him, sitting on the stage in the ghost town theater, surrounded by shadowy figures. The camera slowly zoomed in on his face, and as he stared into the lens, his own voice whispered, "It's your turn now." Emily Barnes never expected her new job to change her life, let alone unravel everything she thought she knew about the world. She had been hired as a transcriptionist for Monarch Research, a small but reputable science organization nestled in a quiet rural town. The job seemed perfect: flexible hours, decent pay, and most importantly, a chance to work from home. Her task was simple: transcribe audio recordings from field researchers and upload them to the organization's private server. Most of the recordings were mundane: observations about plant life, geological surveys, and data on weather patterns. But every so often, a recording would catch her attention, full of whispered discussions and coded language that made her skin crawl. It wasn't until she received the audio file labeled Subject 9, Progress Report, that she realized something was terribly wrong. The file began innocently enough, with a man's voice reading off a date and location. June 18th, Site 14B, observing containment progress of Subject 9. Emily's fingers hovered over her keyboard as the voice continued, now tinged with a mix of excitement and dread. Subject 9's reaction to stimuli has exceeded expectations. Attempts to simulate human interaction have resulted in remarkable behavior. The subject appears to anticipate our moves. It's learning. Emily frowned, rewinding the clip to ensure she heard it correctly. The voice went on, describing experiments that didn't sound like they had anything to do with plants or geology. Phrases like cognitive replication and biological mimicry popped up repeatedly. Then came the part that stopped her cold. Containment protocols are holding, but exposure risk remains high. Should the subject breach its current confinement, it could escalate beyond control. No external reports are to be made. Repeat, no external reports. Any breach must be neutralized immediately, regardless of personnel casualties. There was a long pause, followed by a softer, almost pleading voice. We shouldn't have created it. The recording ended abruptly. Emily sat frozen, her heart racing. What could they have created that required such secrecy? And why was she, a mere transcriptionist, allowed access to something this classified? She tried to convince herself it was a mistake, that the file had been sent to her by accident. But as the days passed, more recordings like it appeared in her queue. They spoke of containment breaches, adaptive intelligence, and emergency protocols. The voices in the recordings were increasingly tense, bordering on panicked. One night, unable to resist her curiosity, Emily began researching Monarch Research. She expected to find public records of their harmless environmental studies. Instead, she found almost nothing. No staff directories, no published findings, just vague mentions of government partnerships and classified operations. The deeper she dug, the more she realized how little she knew about the organization she worked for. A week later, Emily received a new recording. The file name was different this time. No dates or locations, just a single word: evacuation. The voice on this recording was trembling. Subject 9 has breached containment. All personnel are to evacuate Site 14B immediately. Emergency lockdown initiated. If you are hearing this, leave your station and do not return. Do not engage with the subject. Repeat, do not engage. Emily's stomach churned as she listened. The voice was cut off by a loud crash, followed by a piercing, inhuman shriek. She yanked off her headphones, her pulse thundering in her ears. What had they unleashed? That night, Emily's house was eerily quiet. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though she knew it was irrational. Still, she double-checked her locks and closed all the curtains before settling into bed. Sometime after midnight, she was jolted awake by the sound of her phone buzzing. It was an email from Monarch Research. Subject 9 termination update. Classified personnel only. Against her better judgment, she clicked it. The email contained no text, just an attachment labeled Visual Report. Emily hesitated for a long moment before opening it. The video began with shaky footage of a darkened corridor. Flashlights illuminated overturned desks, broken glass, and walls smeared with something dark and unidentifiable. Then came the sound of footsteps. The camera whipped around, focusing on a figure in the distance. It was human-shaped but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements unnervingly fluid. And its face, or what should have been its face, was a blank, smooth surface. The video cut off as the figure lunged at the camera. Emily slammed her laptop shut, her breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't just some corporate experiment gone wrong. This was something far beyond human understanding, something that shouldn't exist. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. "You've seen too much. Leave now." Before she could respond, the power in her house went out. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Emily scrambled for her flashlight, her heart pounding in her chest. As the beam of light swept across her living room, she saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing just outside her window, its featureless face tilted as if observing her. Emily didn't wait to see what it would do. She grabbed her car keys and bolted for the door, her flashlight swinging wildly as she ran. She didn't stop driving until she was miles away, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. In the weeks that followed, Emily abandoned her job, her home, and her old life. She changed her number, moved to a different state, and tried to forget. But the nightmares didn't stop. And every so often, when she was alone, she would catch a glimpse of something, a shadow too tall, a reflection that lingered a second too long. She knew it was still out there, watching, waiting, and she knew that one day it would find her again. The beach was supposed to be their escape. After months of grueling work and personal setbacks, Megan, Ethan, and Sarah, friends since college, decided it was time for a break. They rented a small, isolated beach house on the recommendation of a colleague who described it as hidden but beautiful. The drive was long and winding, leading them further away from the bustling city and deeper into the wilderness. By the time they arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the ocean in hues of gold and crimson. The beach house stood solitary against the backdrop of the crashing waves, its white paint weathered and peeling. "This is rustic," Sarah said, wrinkling her nose. "It has character," Ethan replied with a grin, hauling their bags inside. Megan stood for a moment, staring at the beach. There was something strange about it. No footprints, no signs of other people. It was as if the sand hadn't been touched in years. Inside, the house was cozy but dated. Old furniture, a faint musty smell, and a collection of nautical trinkets gave it the air of a place long forgotten by time. Megan noticed a faded map of the area pinned to the wall. "What's this?" she asked, tracing her fingers over the yellowed paper. "Looks like the coastline," Ethan said, joining her. "But what's that?" In the corner of the map was a small, handwritten note. "Beware the tide." "Creepy," Sarah said, peeking over their shoulders. "Probably some old sailor superstition. Or maybe they just didn't want people to get caught in the waves," Megan offered, though the words lingered in her mind. The first day was uneventful. They spent the morning exploring the beach, collecting shells, and enjoying the solitude. The sand was soft and untouched, and the water was unusually clear, shimmering in shades of blue and green. But as the afternoon wore on, Megan started noticing strange things. The tide seemed to move faster than normal, advancing and retreating in erratic patterns. She thought she saw something glinting in the water, a flash of silver, like an object or a figure just beneath the surface. "Megan, you coming?" Ethan called. She shook off the feeling and joined her friends, but the unease stayed with her. That night, the wind picked up, howling against the windows. Ethan and Sarah were playing cards in the living room when Megan heard a sound, a faint melodic hum. She stepped outside, the cool night air sending a chill down her spine. The beach was bathed in moonlight, and the tide had receded far enough to reveal a stretch of sand that hadn't been visible earlier. Drawn by the sound, Megan walked toward the water. The hum grew louder, rhythmic and haunting, like a distant song. Then she saw them. Figures in the distance, standing motionless where the ocean met the sand. They were tall and shadowy, their features indistinct. Megan's breath caught in her throat as one of the figures turned its head toward her. "Megan!" She jumped as Ethan grabbed her arm. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, glancing nervously at the water. I thought I heard something," she stammered, her eyes darting back to where the figures had been, but they were gone. "You're probably just tired," Ethan said, leading her back to the house, but Megan wasn't so sure. The next morning, Megan told Sarah and Ethan about what she'd seen. "Figures? Like people?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowed. "I don't know. They didn't look human." Ethan laughed nervously. "Probably just your imagination. Or shadows. You said it was dark, right?" Megan nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unnatural about this place. That afternoon, they decided to explore a rocky outcrop at the far end of the beach. The tide was low, exposing jagged rocks and tidal pools filled with strange, iridescent creatures. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a cluster of shells that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. "Never seen anything like it," Ethan muttered, crouching for a closer look. Megan wandered away, drawn by a faint glimmer further down the shore. She found an old, rusted locket half buried in the sand. When she opened it, she saw a faded photo of a woman smiling, a woman who looked eerily familiar. "Guys, I think we should head back," she called. Before they could respond, the wind shifted, carrying with it a low, guttural sound. It wasn't the hum from before. It was something darker, deeper. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. The tide was rising rapidly now, faster than seemed natural. Water surged over the rocks, cutting off their path back to the house. "Run!" Ethan shouted. They scrambled over the slick rocks, the waves crashing closer and closer. By the time they reached the safety of the sand, they were drenched and shaken. That night, Megan dreamed of the locket. In her dream, the woman in the photo was standing on the beach, her face twisted in fear. Behind her, shadowy figures rose from the water, their long arms reaching for her. Megan woke with a start, her heart racing. She grabbed the locket from her nightstand and stared at it. The image of the woman burned into her mind. She knew she had seen her before, in the old photos hanging in the hallway of the beach house. Determined to get answers, Megan searched the house while Ethan and Sarah slept. She found a dusty journal hidden in a drawer, its pages filled with frantic handwriting. "They come with the tide. Do not answer their call. Do not take what belongs to them." Her hands trembled as she read the final entry. "If you hear the song, it's already too late." A loud crash from outside made her jump. She ran to the window and saw the figures again, closer this time. They stood in the shallow water, their heads tilted as if listening. Then the hum began. Ethan and Sarah woke to Megan shaking them. "We have to leave now," she said, her voice urgent. "What's going on?" Ethan asked groggily. "There's no time. Please just trust me." They packed in record time, throwing their belongings into bags and rushing to the car. As they sped away, Megan glanced in the rearview mirror. The beach was empty, but the hum lingered in her ears, a warning that she knew she would never forget. Weeks later, Megan tried to find more information about the beach house. She discovered that it had a history of unexplained disappearances. Locals avoided the area, calling it the Forgotten Shore. Ethan and Sarah tried to move on, dismissing the events as a series of coincidences. But Megan couldn't shake the feeling that they had barely escaped something ancient and malevolent. And on quiet nights, when the world was still, she swore she could hear the faint hum of the tide calling her back. When Mark and Alice moved into their new home, they thought it was perfect. A spacious 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. It was exactly what they had been searching for to start their life together. The real estate agent had called it a hidden gem, and the price was almost too good to be true. The house had everything they needed: a cozy living room, a modern kitchen, and a backyard big enough for weekend barbecues. But there was one odd feature: a small locked room at the end of the upstairs hallway. "It's just a storage space," the agent had said casually when Alice asked about it. The previous owner kept it sealed for privacy reasons. Mark and Alice didn't think much of it at the time. They were too excited about their new home to let a locked door bother them. But it didn't stay locked for long. The first few weeks in the house were uneventful. They spent their days unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and getting to know their neighbors. The locked room became an afterthought, until the day Alice found the key. She was cleaning the garage when she noticed a small, rusted key tucked into the corner of a shelf. Intrigued, she brought it inside and showed it to Mark. "Do you think it's for the room upstairs?" she asked. "Only one way to find out," Mark said with a shrug. They climbed the stairs together, the key feeling heavy in Alice's hand. When she slid it into the lock, it turned with a satisfying click. The door creaked open, revealing a small windowless room. The walls were bare, painted a dull gray, and the only piece of furniture was an old wooden chair in the center of the room. "Well, this is, underwhelming," Mark said, stepping inside. Alice nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air in the room felt different, heavier somehow, and there was a faint hum, so quiet it was almost imperceptible. "Let's just leave it for now," Alice said. "We can figure out what to do with it later." Mark agreed, and they shut the door. That night, Alice had trouble sleeping. She kept dreaming of the room, the hum growing louder and louder until it filled her ears. When she woke up, her heart was racing, and the strange sensation lingered. She decided to check the room again while Mark was at work. When she opened the door, she was startled to find that the chair was no longer in the center of the room. It had been pushed against the far wall. Alice frowned. Did Mark move it? She wondered aloud. Shaking off her unease, she stepped inside. This time she noticed something else, a faint ticking sound, like a clock. But there was no clock in the room. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. She backed out quickly and closed the door. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Objects around the house would move on their own. Keys left on the kitchen counter would appear in the bedroom, and picture frames on the walls would tilt for no reason. Mark dismissed it as them still settling into the house, but Alice wasn't convinced. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, they both heard it, a loud thud from upstairs. Mark grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. Alice followed close behind. When they reached the room at the end of the hall, the door was wide open. The chair was back in the center of the room, but this time it was facing the doorway. Mark stepped inside, shining the flashlight around. "Nothing here," he said, but Alice wasn't so sure. She noticed that the hum had grown louder and the air felt even heavier than before. "Let's just lock it up again," she said, pulling him back into the hallway. That night, Mark decided to set up a camera in the room. "Just to put your mind at ease," he told Alice. The next morning, they reviewed the footage. For hours, nothing happened, but at exactly 3:15 a.m., the screen flickered. The chair began to move, sliding across the floor as if pushed by an invisible hand. Then the video froze for several seconds before the feed returned to normal. "This has to be some kind of glitch," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. Alice shook her head. "There's something wrong with that room." Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, they did some research on the house's history. They discovered that the previous owner, an elderly man named Walter Grayson, had lived there alone for decades. He was known for his reclusive behavior and had rarely interacted with his neighbors. But what caught their attention was a police report from 5 years earlier. According to the report, Grayson had vanished without a trace. The only clue left behind was a series of strange carvings on the walls of the locked room, carvings that had since been painted over. That evening, Alice decided to confront the room one last time. She opened the door and stepped inside, determined to find the source of the hum. As she examined the walls, she noticed faint scratches beneath the gray paint, symbols that looked like circles and intersecting lines. Suddenly the hum grew louder and the room seemed to vibrate. The door slammed shut behind her, and the ticking sound returned, faster and faster. "Alice!" Mark shouted, pounding on the door. "I'm here!" she screamed back, but her voice sounded distant, as if coming from far away. The room began to blur, the walls shifting and spinning. Alice felt as though time itself was speeding up, moments slipping past her in a blur. When the door finally burst open and Mark pulled her out, she collapsed in his arms, gasping for breath. The clock on the hallway wall read 7:30 p.m., but when Alice checked her watch, it said 2:15 a.m., hours ahead of real time. They left the house the next day, unable to explain what had happened. Months later, the house went back on the market. The listing described it as a charming family home with great potential, and the room at the end of the hallway remained locked, its secrets waiting for the next unsuspecting owners. Oliver had always been a fan of Reddit. Its endless labyrinth of stories, discussions, and humor was a welcome escape from his otherwise dull life. But his favorite subreddit, by far, was one dedicated to horror stories, an amalgamation of chilling tales ranging from urban legends to personal encounters with the supernatural. He often joked with his friends about how he couldn't get enough of the posts tagged "True Story." "It's all just creative writing," they'd scoff. But Oliver wasn't so sure. There was a rawness to some of the stories, a visceral sense of fear that couldn't be faked. One Friday night, after scrolling through dozens of posts, he stumbled upon a thread titled, "Whatever you do, don't reply to this." The username was odd, just a string of random numbers and letters. The post itself was short, almost dismissive. "If you find this, you've already gone too far. You'll want to comment. Don't. Just close the app. Walk away." Oliver smirked. It was an obvious ploy for attention. Still, curiosity got the better of him, and he clicked on the comments. The top comment was a warning. "Seriously, don't reply to this thread." I did, and things haven't been the same since. Underneath were dozens of replies from other users, recounting strange experiences after engaging with the thread. One user claimed their computer started typing on its own. Another described a shadowy figure outside their window. "This is just people feeding into the joke," Oliver muttered to himself, but he couldn't look away. As he scrolled further, a comment caught his eye. "At Oliver 315, don't reply." His heart skipped a beat. That was his username. What the? He whispered. He clicked to check the commenter's profile, but it had been deleted. Oliver sat back, his pulse quickening. It had to be a coincidence. Someone probably guessed a random username, and it happened to match his. Still, it unnerved him. He decided to reply to the thread, half out of defiance and half out of curiosity. Nice try. Not falling for it, he typed. He hit send and waited, expecting nothing. The first sign something was wrong came almost immediately. His browser froze, the screen glitching for a moment before his entire computer shut off. Great, he muttered, reaching for his phone. But when he unlocked it, he saw a notification from Reddit. New message from deleted. Against his better judgment, he opened it. I told you not to reply. Chills ran down his spine. He tried to reply, but the message vanished before he could type a word. Frustrated, he closed the app and decided to call it a night. The dreams began that night. He found himself sitting at his computer, the Reddit thread open in front of him. The screen was alive with comments, each one blurring into the next, until they became a swirling vortex of words. A figure emerged from the vortex, a tall, faceless silhouette. It didn't move, but Oliver felt its presence growing closer, suffocating him. He woke up drenched in sweat, the dream still vivid in his mind. The next morning, Oliver tried to brush off the unease. He told himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But when he logged back into Reddit, the thread was gone. No trace of it remained, not even in his comment history. Okay, this is weird, he muttered. He posted about the experience on a different subreddit, asking if anyone else had seen the thread. The replies came quickly. One user wrote, I saw it too. Deleted my comment immediately. Weird stuff happened after. Another added, it's a cursed thread. Been popping up for years under different usernames. Just ignore it. But the most unsettling comment came from someone claiming to have researched the thread's origins. It's not just a thread, it's a doorway. Every time someone replies, it gets stronger. Over the next few days, Oliver began noticing strange occurrences. His computer would flicker on and off by itself. Random notifications appeared on his phone, calls from unknown numbers, text messages that disappeared before he could read them. And then there were the shadows. At first, he thought it was just his eyes playing tricks on him. Dark shapes flickering in his peripheral vision, always vanishing when he turned to look. But they grew bolder, lingering longer, moving closer. One night, as Oliver sat in his dimly lit room, he received another message on Reddit. It's here. His blood ran cold. Before he could react, his screen went black. The shadows in the room thickened, coalescing into a shape, a figure, tall and faceless, just like in his dream. Who are you? Oliver whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed at his computer. The screen flickered back on, displaying a single sentence. You let it in. Oliver tried to escape, but no matter where he went, the figure followed. It appeared in reflections, lingered in doorways, and haunted his dreams. Desperate, he returned to Reddit, searching for answers. He found another thread about the curse, filled with others who had encountered the entity. One comment stood out. The only way to break free is to warn others. But be careful. The more you share, the more it spreads. Oliver hesitated. If he posted about his experience, would he be condemning others, or was it already too late? He typed his final post with shaking hands. If you're reading this, don't reply. Don't engage. Just close the app and walk away. Trust me. As he hit send, the shadows around him grew darker, the figure stepping closer. And somewhere, on a quiet night, another user stumbled upon a new thread. Whatever you do, don't reply to this. Elliot was a mail carrier in the small, forgotten town of Blackwood. With its winding streets and dense forests, the town had an air of mystery that lingered in its every corner. Elliot had taken the job after moving to Blackwood in search of a quieter life. Delivering mail was simple, predictable, just what he needed. For most of the year, his route was routine. The usual letters, packages, and occasional friendly nods from the townsfolk filled his days. But as autumn arrived, bringing with it longer nights and a chill in the air, his work began to change. It started with a single envelope, deep black, with no return address. The envelope appeared one evening just as Elliot was about to clock out. It was sitting on his desk at the post office, the black paper stark against the faded wood. "Who dropped this off?" he asked his co-worker Martha, a gruff woman who'd worked there for decades. "No one. I found it in the drop box," she said without looking up. Elliot examined the envelope. There was no postage, no sender, just a single word written in ornate silver lettering. Deliver. The address was unfamiliar. It wasn't on his usual route, but curiosity got the better of him. He decided to deliver it on his way home. The address led him to the edge of town, where the streets grew darker and less familiar. The house was an old Victorian, its paint peeling and windows clouded with grime. It looked abandoned. Elliot knocked on the door, the sound echoing eerily. No answer. He tried again, louder this time. As he turned to leave, the door creaked open. No one was there. "Hello?" he called, stepping inside. The air was cold and smelled of damp wood. A faint light flickered in the hallway, but the house was otherwise silent. He placed the envelope on a small table by the door and hurried out, his unease growing with every step. The next day, another black envelope appeared, this time on the seat of his mail truck. Elliot froze. He hadn't told anyone about the house or the strange delivery. This envelope, like the first, bore no postage or return address, only the word "deliver." The address was different, but equally obscure. He considered ignoring it, but something compelled him to follow through. This time, the address led him to an old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. The massive structure loomed over him, its broken windows like empty eyes. Elliot hesitated but eventually walked to the rusted door. It groaned as he pushed it open, revealing a cavernous space filled with shadows. "Hello? I have a delivery," he called, his voice echoing. A figure stepped out of the darkness, its face obscured by a hood. Elliot handed over the envelope, his hands trembling. The figure took it without a word and disappeared into the shadows. From that night on, the black envelopes became a nightly occurrence. Each one led him to stranger and darker places: a cemetery, a crumbling church, an overgrown park. The recipients were always silent, their faces hidden in shadow. Elliot began to dread the sound of the envelopes sliding into his mailbox or appearing on his desk. He tried to ask Martha about them, but she just shrugged. "Mail comes in, we deliver it. That's the job." One night he decided to refuse. When the envelope appeared on his kitchen table, though he was certain he'd locked the door, he crumpled it and threw it in the trash. The following morning he woke to find the envelope back on the table, perfectly smooth. "Deliver," it seemed to whisper, though there were no voices in the room. The deliveries grew more unsettling. One led him deep into the woods, where the trees seemed to close in around him. Another brought him to an underground tunnel he didn't know existed. The recipients were changing too. At first, they were merely silent and hooded. Now they seemed wrong. Their movements were jerky, their limbs too long, their breaths too shallow. He began to wonder if they were even human. Elliot tried to quit. He walked into the post office one morning, ready to hand in his resignation. But when he opened his locker, a black envelope was waiting for him. He didn't tell Martha. He didn't tell anyone. That night, he drove to the address listed on the envelope, a knot of fear tightening in his chest. This address was his own. His hands shook as he climbed the steps to his house. The lights inside flickered, though he knew he hadn't left them on. He opened the door and stepped inside, the black envelope still in his hand. The house was eerily quiet, the air heavy with an unfamiliar smell, something metallic. He placed the envelope on the table, unsure of what else to do. As he turned to leave, he heard a soft rustling behind him. The envelope had opened itself. A single sheet of paper slid out, blank except for one word written in the same silver ink. "Look." Elliot glanced around, his breath quickening. He He noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small door in the wall, one that hadn't been there the day before. He hesitated, but the pull was undeniable. He opened the door to find a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The steps creaked under his weight as he descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom was a small, dimly lit room. In the center was a table, and on the table was another black envelope. This one was addressed to him. Elliot's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a photograph of himself, sitting at his kitchen table. But behind him, in the photo, was a shadowy figure. The figure moved. The lights went out. Elliot was never seen again. The post office found his mail truck abandoned on the edge of town, the keys still in the ignition. Months later, a new mail carrier took over his route. On their first day, they found a black envelope waiting for them on the seat of their truck. It bore no return address. Only one word: deliver. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. I hope you found some peace and comfort. Before you drift off completely, let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and which country you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Until next time, rest well and sweet dreams.